Dear students, dear friends, welcome to our Political Science 102 module. Your tutor is Assistant Professor Dr. Şevki Kıralp. We'll be together in our videos, in our classes, in our module, and we'll be talking about an improved form of update in your political science knowledge, in your basic political science knowledge. Dear friends, first thing to start with, the first class of the module will be about the emerging concepts in politics. When I'm talking about the emerging concepts, I'm talking about some new phenomena that political scientists, politicians, and international or global public opinion talk about. Some of them are about ideologies, some of them are about facts, and some of them are about both. To begin with, New Right. That's amongst the most outstanding emerging concepts in contemporary politics. The right as an ideology, as you are familiar with, is based on conservatism, liberalism in economy, nationalism. It has three axioms. And actually, the concept we talk about, New Right, is mostly about conservatism and liberalism. A more conservative society, a more conservative state, it might be a part of the New Right, or a more liberal economic model might also be a form of emerging New Right. Dear friends, in 1970s, the New Right, led by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, she was the leader of the British Conservative Party, upraised as a new concept in 1970s. Their political orientation was based on two facts, as I told you: neoconservatism and neoliberalism. Apparently, it has nothing to do with nationalism, at least at the theoretical basis, because it is more engaged to the conservative and liberal thoughts. Dear friends, when we talk about neoconservatism or neoliberalism, we do not mean a new form of liberalism or a new form of conservatism. We actually mean conservatism again and more conservatism, and liberalism again and more liberalism. One of the ex-American presidents, Ronald Reagan, was also another outstanding leader of the New Right in his period of time. Currently, German Prime Minister Angela Merkel is amongst the most outstanding leaders of that New Right formation. And the current president, actually, the president who is going to be in charge in United States in a few days, Donald Trump, will also, he is most probably he will be amongst the leaders of the so-called New Right. Dear friends, as I told you, neoliberalism is about the economy, politics. It follows the Friedman School or the Chicago School in economy. It aims to increase the privatizations and minimize the state's role in economy, and also minimize the size of the public servants. So, it basically aims to decrease the governmental expenditures, the state expenditures, and make the make the private sector dominant in economy. So, according to them, for instance, if you have an airport, a state-run airport, you might rent it temporarily to a private company. So, when you rent the airport's management, you own some money and you pay some of your public debts. This is a form of privatization. So the Friedman school, the neoliberal school, attaches importance to privatization, because according to them, the state, the government, as long as the state and the government play a role in the economic production or in the economic process, the greater expenditures they have. So in order to minimize the states and the government's expenditures, we have to make the private sector more dominant in economy. And how do we make the private sector more dominant in economy? Of course, by privatization. Dear friends, another ideological stance in the emerging concepts in politics is the third way. The third way is actually generated by Anthony Giddens. And it's a way of confronting the neoliberal policies. The third way aims to keep the liberal economy as well as the social state and social justice in a form of equilibrium. So yes, it's liberal, but not neoliberal. For instance, the third way supports fair taxation. For instance, who earns more should pay more taxes, or the one who spends more should pay more taxes, something like that. So fair taxation, that's important. For instance, American President Bill Clinton used to reform the American taxation system, and his policies were based on what? They were based on the third way. Tony Blair, the ex-British Prime Minister, Gerhard Schröder, the ex-German Prime Minister, and Bill Clinton, most importantly Bill Clinton. Those three figures were the most outstanding leaders of the third way economy. Another feature of the third way is that it pays attention to success, performance, and meritocracy in public sector and in private sector. What does it mean? A civil servant who works harder than one of his or her fellow public servants should be awarded, because the hard work should be rewarded. The success should be rewarded. That's one of the understanding that the third way has. So it is a synthesis of social liberalism and social democracy. We might not call that the third way is a rightist ideology, or we cannot say that it's a leftist ideology, but it's an attempt on balancing liberalism and social democracy. Dear friends, another emerging concept in contemporary politics is the radical left. The socialist leader in Greece, Alexis Tsipras, and his party, Syriza, when they came into power, they were after balancing the neoliberal policies in European Union. When we are talking about the neoliberal policies in European Union, I'm talking about the Troika's manipulations of Greek economy. Because of the public debts of Greece, Germany or European Union, or we might call it Troika, are manipulating Greece to make some economic reforms, a set of economic reforms. Actually, they are manipulating, or to some extent dictating, those policies, because Greece requires to get a form of financial support to get rid of the economic crisis, the current economic crisis. 2.5 years ago, when Mr. Tsipras came into power, he was actually anti-neoliberal. He was socialist and he was radical against the European Union's central neoliberal policies. But I don't know whether you were interested in politics 2 or 3 years ago. I rather clearly saw that the European Union managed to convince Mr. Tsipras to implement the set of neoliberal reforms. So Mr. Tsipras's radical left remained as a hope. It didn't came into practice. Another very important emerging concept in contemporary politics is the Islamophobia. Islam, as you are familiar with, is a religion. It's the religion of Muslims. Its holy book is Quran and its prophet is Muhammad. And phobia is scaring of something, being afraid of something. So if you put the two words together, it means the fear of Islam. Mostly in Western societies and dominantly in Christian societies, there is a fear and anger against Muslims. Why it happens? It happens because of the terrorism and the war in Middle East and the global terrorism. In many countries, there are, for instance, bombing attacks that are being committed by fundamentalist terrorist organizations, and that creates fear amongst the Western societies and amongst the Western states. But there are some other aspects of Islamophobia. For instance, during the Syrian civil war, hundreds of thousands of Syrians became refugees. They had to leave their country, they had to abandon their country, and while they were trying to go to the European Union countries, the European Union countries blocked their borders. No, they said, you cannot come into our countries. And some scholarship argues that that was another form of Islamophobia. And there is the extreme right, for instance, extreme nationalism and racism uprising in European Union as another form of Islamophobia. For instance, when the extreme nationalists or extreme racists in Europe, when they see some Muslim people on the roads, they say, well, what are those immigrants? What are those Muslims doing in our country? And they become angry or they become scared. So there are some extreme right, far right political parties that are against the immigrants, that are anti-immigrants. And that anti-immigrantism has also a form of Islamophobia. If you are an immigrant and if you are Muslim, an extreme rightist person is rather unlikely to like you. So another thing, terrorism is also another emerging concept in politics. The organized attacks against Western and Eastern states and civilians is also another phenomenon in the international politics. And there is a tendency to address the terrorism with fundamental Islamism or directly to the Islam. As I told you, there is a relationship between terrorism and Islamophobia. They both trigger each other. Actually, I might say that they both trigger each other. For instance, many states, many countries in the East or in the West, they are currently trying to adjust their security policies according to the threat coming from the terrorism, coming from the terrorist organizations. If your enemy is a state, you know, if you have a look at the map, you see where is the state. Or your intelligence service might provide you information about the military strength of the state, or you know who is the ally of the state or who is the rival of the state. So you have a broad range of knowledge if your enemy is a state. But for the terrorist organizations, it is not so certain. You don't know where is the terrorist organization. They might be all around the world, in every country. They might have some collaborators, some members. And you don't know who is an enemy of the terrorist organization. You don't know who is the friend of the terrorist organization. You have no idea. You cannot be precise or certain about them. And most importantly, you don't know when and how the terrorist organization will attack you, will hit you. So terrorism is a different form of enemy, and it actually shows the weaknesses of the current security policies of many, many states. And there is something I would like to repeat. Terrorism feeds Islamophobia and Islamophobia feeds terrorism. For instance, if you discriminate a person because of his religion, his ethnicity, or whatever, he becomes nervous with you. And if you are nervous with someone, you try to discriminate him or her. So discrimination brings discrimination. So the relationship between Islamophobia and terrorism, sorry, there is a typing mistake in there. I wrote mistakenly. Oh no, it's fine, sorry. Terrorism feeds Islamophobia and Islamophobia feeds terrorism. That's the main logic. And another concept, another theory about that, the clash of civilizations. American political scientist Samuel Huntington, in his notion, Clash of Civilizations, argued that the 21st century would witness a conflict between liberal democrat Christian West and the fundamental Islamist East. Many scholars and many politicians or some NGOs were rather controversial, were rather suspicious about Huntington's notion. They say, well, there is a cooperation between the East and the West. There is no clash of civilizations. But you see, there is a form of terrorism which is being identified with the Islam and the East. And there is another front of the confrontation, which is the liberal democrat Christian West. So there is a conflict between the two realms. And whether Huntington was right or wrong, there is a form of conflict. Maybe we might not call it the clash of civilizations yet, but the conflict is actually occurring. So there is something else to mention at that point. Dear friends, during the Cold War, the liberal democrat West had an enemy, a fundamental enemy. Who was it? It was the communist bloc, the socialist bloc, USSR and her allies. And in 1991, the socialist bloc collapsed. There is no more communist threat for the West. But as an American statesman, an American diplomat who was one of the ex-foreign ministers of United States, Mr. Henry Kissinger, as he says, and actually Samuel Huntington as well is claiming the same thing, the future is going to be shaped between the conflict, clash, rivalry, whatever, between the West and the East. And as I told you, maybe we might not call it a clash of civilizations at the moment, but there is a conflict between the terrorist Islamist organizations and the West, and actually with many other countries in the East, for instance. So the terrorism is currently a global threat. But also Islamophobia is also emerging as a global problem. Dear friends, to sum up, New Right is one of the most outstanding contemporary issues in contemporary politics. In 1970s, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan were the leaders of the New Right. So the New Right means neoconservatism and neoliberalism, which actually mean more conservatism and conservatism again, as well as more liberalism and liberalism again. And currently, the neoliberal school and the neoconservative school in politics is represented primarily by German Prime Minister Angela Merkel and US President Mr. Donald Trump is likely to be another leader of the New Right, neoconservatism and neoliberalism. I have to make a distinction between the two at the moment. Angela Merkel's neoconservatism and neoliberalism are mostly about the future of the Europe, the shape of the Europe. But Mr. Trump's neoconservatism, neoliberalism, might be related to the discrimination, to the distinction between the smart power, soft power and hard power. Soft power and hard power, most basically. When we mean soft power, we mean some form of economic sanctions, some form of cultural dominance, some form of normative or moral values that makes one state to affect the policies of the other state. When we mean soft power, we do not mean war. But when we mean hard power, we mean war. So in American politics, the Republicans are known to be more likely to use hard power, war, in shaping the world politics. So Mr. Trump is a Republican and he is identified with the hard power, and we will see how his politics will look like in the future. Neoliberalism, it follows the Friedman school in economy, aims to increase privatizations and minimize the state's role and influences in economy, and also minimize the state expenditures, government expenditures, and the size of the public service. It means less public servants and actually less expenditures for their salaries. As I told you, third way was a stance, it was a resistance against the neoliberal policies. It was something like a synthesis between the liberalism and social democracy. In other words, between the rightist economic policies and leftist economic policies. It was something like a balance or a synthesis between the two. American President Bill Clinton, he is a Democrat, not a Republican. British Prime Minister Tony Blair, he was a member of the Labour Party, not the Conservative Party. And German Prime Minister Gerhard Schröder, a Social Democrat leader, they were amongst the most outstanding leaders that tried to implement the third way economy policies. Radical left, it actually symbolizes a sharper opposition against neoliberalism and neoconservatism. But I cannot say Mr. Tsipras had been capable of creating the desired effects against the European Union's neoliberal policies. Another thing, Islamophobia, is the fear and anger against Muslims, and actually a form of discrimination, a bad form of discrimination towards the Muslims. And terrorism, as we are familiar with, it's a form of bombing attacks, threatening some states, threatening some societies, and trying to shape their policies. Terror means making someone be afraid of you. So, when you make a bombing attack directed at a location or a state or a society, you do not just aim to kill people, but you also try to threaten the rest, scare the rest. And another fact here, terrorism feeds Islamophobia and Islamophobia feeds terrorism. And the clash of civilizations, the clash between the West and the East, actually the liberal democrat Christian West and the fundamental Islamist East, that's a theory of Samuel Huntington. You might disagree with him, or you might to some extent agree with him, that's his theory. Clash of civilizations, the conflict between the West and the East. Dear friends, that will be all for our first class today. I'll be pleased to meet you in our forthcoming classes in the following weeks. Thank you very much for listening to me. Have a nice day.